Thank you, Gal, for organizing this and for leading CFAIR. This is, of course, the first AAA meeting, so I really appreciate all of you coming to this first session of the AAA meeting for us in this new political era. When we began planning this pre-conference workshop, of course, we didn't know what the result of the election would be. We didn't know what the new funding landscape would be, what the new administration priorities would be. We set an agenda that I think gives a sort of evidence base on which people can bring their priorities and their agendas in this new context to choose the kinds of research themes that each of you individually want to undertake, the kinds of priorities in your civic engagement that you want to follow. And I hope you'll find in the course of the day, in the story arc that Gal just described, methods and kinds of data that will be energizing to discuss with each other right now today and then throughout this AAA meeting that can help us go forward, each of us in our own institutions doing the kinds of work that we are trained and I think uniquely trained to do. So what I want to share is what I am somewhat ambitiously perhaps calling a new economics. You'll see there's a lot of old economics in here too, but some elements of novelty that come from measuring food security in terms of nutrition. So this comes from, for me, 15 years of apprenticeship, if you will, having gone from core traditional ag econ in the ag econ department at Purdue to this School of Nutrition at Tufts, surrounded by people doing nutritional biochemistry, nutritional epidemiology, clinical nutrition, dietetics, public health messaging. Those health scientists have taught me and the colleagues who are here who have been similarly as economists working in the School of Nutrition, just an enormous amount of health science that is not something you can necessarily get just from reading the articles. That's the hallway conversations, the seminars, the actual PhD training that you in Ag Econ and we in Ag Econ know is a big part of our apprenticeship system that you get when you are in the heart of a health science campus with all the different fields of health science and especially in a School of Nutrition to look at the health consequences of food. So in teaching about this together with Park Wilde, who's here, Leah Kostlow and Elena Martinez, who are were PhD students with us, and now sort of bringing this, I hope it's fair to say, new economics of food into other institutions. Norbert Wilson was with us at the Friedman School for some time. Lauren, you came for a year. I hope that people who have this experience of going into a food for health and nutrition kind of come out with a different set of insights. And for teaching this, I sort of distilled together with another graduate of our program, Amelia Finare, into a book that's, if you're interested in teaching this kind of material, gives you 12 chapters for 12 weeks of a semester. And fortunately, thanks to the Gates Foundation funding for this A&H Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy, it is the world's smallest book. So you can just take one of these cards and scan the QR code, put the book on your phone. Students can do that. And I think it's quite helpful to have an open access resource to sort of summarize all this. The book itself includes the work I'll share with you about measuring access to food in terms of the least expensive items for an overall healthy diet. So the first point is that this kind of work, which I've called the new economics, is actually astoundingly old. So I only know the English language history. Of course, in every other civilization, there would have been similar kinds of literatures. But for us, this begins with a book literally published in 1675 by Rice Vaughan, who wrote a book called On Coin and Coinage about what is money. This was a time of great turmoil in how do people make money, what is money worth, the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, the Commercial Revolution in the English-speaking world in England, and he writes this: the hire of laborers and servants carries with it the result of the prices, the monetary prices, of all things generally necessary for a man's life. Now, they don't know anything about food or nutrition. At this time, they didn't even know that there was energy in food. People didn't know that there were such a thing that we ultimately measured as calories. Then, a generation later, William Fleetwood is asked by a group of students at Oxford, could they please update the £5 a year standard for a fellowship? Because prices had risen a lot. And he writes this: how much of modern money would be requisite to purchase the same quantity of corn, meat, drink, and cloth, like that's what a graduate student needs, even today, nowadays. Adam Smith, in some sense the founder of our field, of our discipline, is trying to think about how income and wealth affects, in the wealth of nation, affects different sectors of the economy. And he writes this famous phrase: the rich man consumes no more food than his poor neighbor. Of course, they still didn't know what calories were, right, in 1776. That wasn't discovered until Lavoisier a bit later. But Adam Smith recognizes in quality it may be very different. And our question for us now is, in terms of quality for health, is it very different? And to select and prepare it may require more labor and art. And that's the thing we really are willing to pay for, right, is that delicious and attractive meal. But in quantity of some sense, it's very nearly the same. So that's what we're trying to measure, is what are these quantities that are the qualities that are in food. So a great hero of our entire profession is Molly Orshansky, who in 1965 published a paper called Counting the Poor that specified that a poverty line should be, in the United States it turned out to be, she was successful in this, be enough money for the USDA's Economy Food Plan, the predecessor to the Thrifty Food Plan that Park Wilde will talk about later today, to be 1/3 of household spending. And the reason was that 1/3 of household spending is what the national average was in the 1955 US Household Consumption Survey. So that gives you a sense of how much you should have to spend for food to be considered poor in the United States at the beginning of the War on Poverty in 1965. Martin Revallian, another hero of our profession, defining poverty internationally, said that if you want an international poverty line that initially was the $1 a day World Bank poverty line, just recently updated to $3 in 2021 US dollars, that's based on sufficient calories of the local foods in terms of the mix of actual local foods, right? So if you're in a country where there's pounded yam and peanut stew, it's enough calories of pounded yam and peanut stew. If it's chapati and dal, it's that. If it's rice and beans, it's that, and so forth, okay? So then we had Bob Allen, a very famous economic historian, says, we need the least expensive items, because that's the way you measure access to nutrient adequacy. Regrettably, for us in nutrition, Robert Allen, great economic historian, had not apprenticed in a school of nutrition, and the paper, although it was published in the American Economic Review, is appallingly bad on nutrition. Their referees, of course, didn't know anything about nutrition either. So in this talk, we'll talk about how you can measure access to a healthy diet and how that gives us a sense of food security in the world that's different from other ways of understanding it. Now, by chance, next week on Monday, and then published on the World Bank website on Tuesday and Wednesday, you will have the new data updated to the most recently available, which is regrettably only 2022, because we're sort of 3 years behind. That will be appearing at worldbank.org Food Prices for Nutrition, also at the FAO's State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World website. There would be newspaper reports about these publications. So the basic point here is that when you introduce a new method of measurement, and it's a really useful one, it gives people something to write about and to talk about and to use in policy debates, actively arguing for a more just, humane, and equitable, as well as healthier and more productive set of policies. So this is Google Ngrams, N for the number of words in a phrase, in this case 4 or 5 word phrases. again, just in the English language corpus of books and documents, the gray literature, as well as journal articles that span the recent period. This is, of course, a small fraction of all the English language phrases in all the books. But you see people talking about it a little bit. Back in the 2010s, it became something that people cared about. And as soon as it was measurable, people just wrote a lot about it. And of course, a healthy fraction of this is stuff that's funded by our Food Prices for Nutrition project, because we've been able to work with a lot of collaborators, initially in Ghana, Tanzania, and then across East Africa, West Africa, South Asia. So all those papers are in this, but there's an enormous amount of other writing using these methods around the world. So what's the story? The story is that prior price indexes, of course, don't have any health information about diets. You have consumer price indexes based on actual expenditure. You have global food price indexes that are based on the bulk commodities. What does it cost to have 10,000 pounds of wheat in the hold of a ship? And prior food security metrics refer to foods actually consumed. So in the year I was born, 1961, a great Indian statistician, P.V. Sukhatme, had the idea that if you took national food balance sheets, the quantity of corn or rice plus the quantity of beans or peanuts plus the quantity of dairy or eggs, and you said, well, if that's distributed log normally, he was a statistician, he's like, okay, distributions are likely to be log normal, and you estimate dietary energy requirements per person, you can get the number of people who don't have enough calories for this norm. That's now about 9% of the world's population. Kathy Radimer in the 1980s at Cornell developed a scale that was then adopted in 1995 by the USDA and later by FAO that asks people, did you go to bed hungry? Did you skip a meal? Did you eat less or differently? Due to lack of money or other resources to buy or grow your own food, that's about 2 billion or a quarter of the world's population now. And Park, again, and others will talk about these metrics at great length today. So what do we do that's new? First of all, we use economics to ask if people want many other things in their life. Education, school fees, healthcare and medicine costs, transportation to visit your family members, housing, clothing, etc. We would hope that people would be able to acquire a healthy diet at the lowest possible cost. So given all of the people's desire to pay for their church, to pay for their friends and relatives, to pay for all the things people want in life, we as economists recognize people want that. If they want all that and they also want a healthy diet, we need the least expensive healthy diet. So to measure access, we want the least expensive ones. And it turns out that a third of the world's population cannot afford a healthy diet in that sense. So the idea here is to make a diagnostic metric in the healthcare tradition of differential diagnosis, right? You have a metric and it tells you, is this your problem or is that your problem? So what we do is we measure the cost of a healthy diet, which tells us, is the problem high prices? And we compare that to incomes, which gives us affordability and says, well, maybe the problem is that within a place, your incomes are too low to acquire that cost. And then we have a benchmark of these low-cost healthy items, and that tells us how much of an unhealthy diet is because of displacement. Because instead of these low-cost healthy items, people have chosen something else instead for reasons such as time use and convenience, or perhaps aspirations that are shaped by marketing, as well as culture, and of course, taste, odor, the mouthfeel of food, all of that makes a huge difference as well. So we can differentially diagnose whether the problem of unhealthy diets is caused by agriculture and food distribution, where supply could lower cost, is caused by poverty, where social protection could improve incomes, or is caused by something to do with food attributes, such as their convenience and time use, such as their taste, and especially the role of marketing in leading people, changing people's aspirations about what is appropriate food. So this comes from the scientific consensus among the nutrition researchers in every country of the world, represented by dietary guidelines published by their national authorities. In the United States, this is joint between USDA and HHS. The era of publishing this, what's now MyPlate in the United States, may come to an end now, but other countries are doing this more and more. So almost every country in the world has a process to create their national dietary guidelines because people understand that they need scientific consensus within their country to produce a locally appropriate set of guidelines framed in a way that people can understand that reflects after you chew and swallow food, what do people need for health. In terms of food groups, these are very similar to each other. In terms of the items within the food groups, they're radically different. Right? Sometimes it's rice and beans, chapati and dal, pounded yam and peanut stew, whatever it is locally, that's what it is represented here. But after you chew and swallow, and the species agronomically or in terms of animal production are pretty similar, to allow substitution economically to find the least expensive items, we have to convert things that have very different water weight into their energy shares, because we now know that that's the quantity of food that Adam Smith was talking about, is the amount of energy. Not the amount of water. Some people have very water-dense foods, some people have very dry foods, but after you chew and swallow, what matters to maintain your height and weight and physical activity is the energy shares. These, of course, change with scientific consensus. Our method was based in order to meet the political needs of the decision makers in governments as represented in the United Nations agencies responsible for food, principally FAO, plus UNICEF, World Food Program, World Health Organization, and IFAD. We had 10 quantified guidelines from each of the UN regions. For SOFI 2022, we moved to a more representative method with 31 different countries. That leads my colleague Anna Herforth, a nutrition researcher who has very deep connections to the entire nutrition community. She has been the lead on all of this work representing health needs in a way that we as economists can then measure the least expensive choices for. 6 food groups with these energy shares and these plate shares in terms of what it would look like for something like MyPlate, and this calorie level for a representative adult woman. For SOFI 2024 and this new 25 that's coming out next week, it's different updated price and income data, but the same health criteria. In January 24, Nigeria became the first country to publish this as national statistics, and then collaborators in these other countries have done the same. And another PhD student who's not in the room today but is here at the meetings, Rachel Gilbert, is the person who did the technical assistance to the national statisticians in each of these governments that made this work possible. This other work has been very much led by Lena Martinez, Leah Koslow, who's here with us, and many other collaborators. So the main thing to note here is that this is an international standard developed by the UN in order to represent something that would be aspirational for low-income countries. This is much lower diet quality than would be considered dignified in the United States. So the Thrifty Food Plan, which is really a floor, is turns out to be more than twice as expensive as this because it includes items that Americans would consider to be a minimal, a lot of meat and other things that are more than twice as expensive as this, as even the US MyPlate. Okay, so here's our big discovery. It's that the red dots, which is cost per day, on the left axis, here in 2021 dollars, in poorer versus richer countries, the red dots are about the same, something in the range of $3 to $4 a day, while actual food spending in poor countries is less than half of that. Actual food spending in China, India is first just becoming more than that. Actual food spending in the US and so forth is several times that. Okay? Doesn't mean you're getting a healthy diet either way because of displacement of the healthy items by unhealthy items. So the Thrifty Food Plan now is about $8.20 per person, which is roughly similar to actual food spending, but of course we also spend food away from home in addition to that. Okay. So here's the kinds of items that are the least expensive. You can see for yourself, example of Pakistan. Notice on the animal source foods, buffalo milk, live chicken. Example of Senegal, sardines and small fish. You can see how the actual items differ a lot by the agro-ecosystem, the conditions, the circumstances. In rich countries, Italy, the home of Parmalat, boxed milk. United States, our dairy system is just astoundingly low cost, so you can see how this is a much smaller fraction of the total. And this is the kind of insight that you get from these data. To track affordability for the UN system, these are negotiations between the national representatives of the countries that are members of the UN agencies and the economics division of the FAO, trying to come up with and the statistics division of the FAO, trying to come up with a standard that countries would accept. And it turned out that in 2024, the method we introduced, working with them, is the following. You take the international poverty line of each country, you multiply it times the average of what poorer people are spending. So this is an updated version of what Molly Orshansky did for the US in 1965. And then you get the amount of non-food spending that you would need to add to this diet cost to get affordability thresholds. Now this, of course, has a lot of problems. We'll be improving this method, I hope, over the coming years. But this gives us a way of at least thinking about affordability. And what do you get with affordability? You get that this is the share of the population in the terms of the color. The darkest, of course, the poorest places, but in terms of largest number of people, as is commonly the case, you get South Asia, and you get non-negligible numbers even in middle-income countries. So this gives us a really new insight, helpful insight. Leah Koslow's dissertation includes this remarkable set of findings, knitting together the FAO food balance sheets, the modern version and the old version, quantifying everything in comparable terms relative to this healthy diet basket standard, showing how countries overshoot way above the healthy diet basket standard in terms of animal source foods and oils and fats. This is, broadly speaking, fried meat. I don't know if you ever had fried meat, but it's really good. When people can afford it, even in low and middle income countries, they love it, even in food at home. And then here is, broadly speaking, sugar, and sugar in a lot of things. There's also salty snacks, so added salt in things. And that ends up accounting for quite a lot of calories, actually, and a lot of displacement is on this side as well. So this is industrialized food system. This is really, age old, has nothing to do with ultra processing or anything like that. This is just that fried meat's really delicious. And other fried things too, actually. Fried potatoes, you ever tried that? It's really great. And these exist, in very large quantities since time immemorial. But fruits, of course, way below. No one likes lentils. But we've had enormous improvements in the way of sort of producing these. So there is some possibility that these things are going to become much more popular as innovation proceeds to make these healthy foods more convenient, more delicious, and so forth. Okay. So we get, for this unaffordability of a healthy diet, really a different picture. The black circles here show our new unaffordability metric. And what you see is that it's much more closely tied to income than these earlier metrics. It's more grounded in something that is a transparent algorithm that just runs, literally with R code or Stata code or Excel over the numbers without any statistical machinations. In contrast, experience of food insecurity is done with the RASH index. Park, I think, might talk about that a little bit. It's a little confusing how it works. You get very different results. And undernourishment, you get really very different results as well. Okay. When we track in terms of monthly variation, there's also spatial variation in the Nigeria data, you get an understanding of inflation that's really different from ordinary inflation. So here, this is COHD. The food CPI is here. What you see is that relative to CPI, healthy diets place more weight on basic foods. You just get a very different picture. Here's the items that are the least cost items actually tracked in Nigeria. And here's some examples of how this enters the debate in the, I show you the n-grams of people talking about diet costs. This was particularly important in the Nigeria context in a debate about healthy diets. So work from Elena Martinez has shown that these low-cost items are also less emitting. Here on the horizontal axis, you have the cost of each individual food item in this international global database. So a few dozen items in food categories across 177, I think, countries in the world, 181 countries in this data set. This is a bin scatter, so each dot represents 1/100th of the data set. And what you see is that animal source foods at every price point in cost per calories are a higher level of emissions than every other type of food, but the most expensive vegetables actually have quite high emissions. And some of the low-cost fruits actually have pretty high emissions as well, but that generally speaking within any food group, the lower cost ones are the ones that have, for the case of animal source foods, the least feed, the least land use impact, and the least enteric emissions, so less methane. In terms of the vegetables, there's a variety of emissions that arise in the higher cost items that you just avoid when you just choose the least cost ones. In contrast, nutritional profile doesn't correlate like that at all. So here, you're getting lower emissions because the lower cost just use less resources. But using less resources to get lower cost items doesn't mean it's more or less healthier. Because the healthiness of food within a food group depends on things like the salt to potassium ratio or the unsaturated to saturated fat ratio. And those are not just a direct sort of cost thing. So you get these much varied relationships. To understand nutritional value, you need to really read the label and have a better label. To understand environmental footprint within a food group, you can kind of just choose. Frugality is basically the same as a smaller footprint in terms of all the resources. Now, of course, that's not entirely true. Whenever and Elena has a great new paper that, two new papers that look at where it isn't true. And we'll be presenting those, I'm not sure, I'm remembering which day during the meetings, but if you look in the app for Elena Martinez's presentations, you'll see where it isn't true as well as where it is true, because it's extremely interesting how the emissions and cost are sometimes similar and sometimes not telling you the same information. So what about the US? In the US, we are, overall CPI is here. Overall food CPI is here on average over the past 12 months. You see, of course, that having ticked up here, we are deeply uncertain about the future trajectory of this. There, of course, is downward demand pressure where people are no longer flush with cash, and that will limit the pricing power of food companies. But there's some very strong upward cost pressures on food prices. So we see beef prices spiking, but other prices moderating. We really don't know whether this will spike back up or not. But of course, the point of all this is that healthy diet costs are really very different from ordinary food costs, and that we need to be very aware of how the price variation differs by stage of the value chain. I think people are familiar with this run-up in restaurant prices, even as grocery prices are much lower, more stable, and farm prices are just all over the place. Aware very much of this variation in the types of foods. Here's the rise in beef and other animal source foods. We've had this, I think, off the radar steady decline in the price of vegetables here. Sorry, didn't need the, in the price of vegetables, getting more and more, like we need to understand how to take advantage of these low-cost vegetables. And we are able to recognize how the USDA food dollar data show that when we buy food, like it's mostly this post-harvest services. So this whole revolution, sort of new economics of food for health and nutrition is trying to understand, is this retail trade and food service and wholesale trade, as well as the food processing, to what degree is that contributing to this displacement of the low-cost healthy items, including the vegetables that you just saw on the previous slide, that are increasingly cheap in the United States, to what degree are these parts of our food system, which dominates employment, dominates consumer expenditure, is that leading this small fraction, which is the actual farm produce, right, to be displaced from healthy to unhealthy items. So in conclusion, what do we have? A new method that tells us that about a third of the world simply cannot afford an overall healthy diet because nutrient-rich foods are just more expensive to ship in terms of the food group. But most of the unaffordability is because of low incomes. You saw the map from Africa, South Asia. So basically, it's about development in that regard. Off-farm development incomes in addition to agricultural productivity. Even if healthy diets are affordable, they're often displaced because people, really like fried foods, really like sugar, but they also really like added sodium and processed and packaged foods, really like refined grains in contrast to whole grains and so forth. And doing this calculation, I believe, helps us to guide intervention in more evidence-based directions. So that concerns how to make lower cost and more useful and easily used foods, how to produce these foods with the lower cost ingredients in lower cost ways in terms of environmental and resource use cost as well as monetary cost, how we really cannot rely on the appearance. You can't see, taste, or smell the nutritional value of food. Nutritional labels may not tell you much, and price doesn't give you a good guide either. So you're going to need some other way of choosing for healthy diet. And that there's these other factors that economists are, I think, increasingly good at thinking about, is all these substitution based on all these attributes, and how we can use data in more thoughtful ways. So thanks for your patience in sort of thinking this through to frame the discussion today. This is all funded by the Gates Foundation plus the UK government, collaboration, as I mentioned, with international agencies, and especially the work of our collaborators in the countries, and people working like Elena, Leah, Norbert Park, other colleagues at Tufts and in many other institutions. Thank you.